next speaker is Mr. Joe Cutter. I had the opportunity to talk to him when my daughter was about 18 months old. We decided we wanted her to have a cane. And we ran into a little resistance from her teachers. So I called the NFB and I asked them who could I get in touch with about this, and they gave me Joe's number. And I left him a message, and he called me back on a Sunday night, and we talked for almost 2 hours. And that really gave me the confidence to go ahead and order a cane for Kendra ourselves, and to really push for her to start getting training on how to use it. And of course, she didn't use it correctly at 18 months, but she just turned 4 last month, and she uses her cane all the time. And so for us, it was definitely the right decision. And I'm going to turn it over to Joe. He's had 35 years experience in this field. He's a wonderful speaker, and he's a great resource.
I think before I make some of my comments, I want to respond to the really thoughtful and delightful messages of the teens and memory. And also, I really like the feeling of the interaction between the audience and the speaker. So, although I have a plan or two with some video sequences, if we don't get to them now, we'll get to them more this afternoon, and maybe even during lunchtime in a more informal way, we might be able to share some of them. I feel compelled to address a few things that were said. Absolutely, when Chelsea was talking about all the different elementary schools that she's been in, as a professional service provider in the field of blindness, and I consider myself a blindness consultant. I'll explain a little more why later. I think transitioning, whether it's preschool to kindergarten, or early intervention to preschool, and having all those elementary shifts and transitioning, that blind children are really vulnerable to not getting all the information that we shared the year before from that teacher, and then to transition smoothly to the next teacher. It's almost like each year, as someone who worked as an itinerant year after year, I had to reinvent the wheel with the new staff, especially when it was in a new school. And I had to reinvent it top down, from the administrator all the way down to someone who was working in the cafeteria. It is ultimately the responsibility of a child for travel. That's the reality. Ultimately, it's the child's responsibility. It's our responsibility as parents and professional service providers to work with the children in sharing the rights, the roles, and the responsibilities, and giving appropriate and adequate instruction so that they can take on those appropriate responsibilities in life. Another point I wanted to address, it seemed to me that as someone who was conventionally trained in orientation and mobility in 1970, and I come from the School of University Training after post-World War II, and many of you may know or not know that orientation mobility as a profession is fairly new and started post-World War II, and it started with a Veterans Administration medical model, adult-centered, developed by sighted guys for sighted guys and women who had lost vision in war. One thing I'd like to really pass on is that I'm really working with what I've learned from NFB as a skills definition of blindness. And the answer is in not how much vision you have, or how much visual acuity you have, or what your eye condition is. When it comes to functioning on a day-to-day basis, what I've learned is you have vision for what you can see, and the skills of blindness for what you can't. So when you're employing a skill of blindness, you're blind as far as identifying with oneself as who you are. So that when a partially sighted child does not move with a cane and moves with 100% safety and efficiency and comfortableness, that's one thing. But if every once in a while they're monitored by being touched on their shoulder to slow down, or be careful of that audio-visual cart being pulled out of the classroom at the last second, or the child in line bends over to tie their shoelaces and they're going to take a header and the teacher stops them. That's obtrusive availability. And that's a cause for them needing to use their cane. What we're seeking is unobtrusive availability. We want adults to be available and others to be available to blind kids, but not to be obtrusive in their lives. The third thought I'd like to pass on, I think memory really brought out the important, something we should never forget is that each child comes with a personality. And each personality comes with feelings. And there's a whole language of feelings. And that I remember a parent saying to me, and equally as well, each parent comes with feelings and a personality. And I remember a parent saying to me who had started off in being educated about blindness by going to not the National Federation of the Blind, Parents of Blind Children support group, but another support group. And she said, you know, when I went to the other support group, what I learned to do is, we were using the expression before, freak out, or I learned to cry and get support about my feelings and how, quote, difficult it was. And she said, but we never went beyond that. When I came to the Parents of Blind Children, the National Federation of the Blind, my feelings were respected. And I was able to take my feelings at the level they were, but I could move forward through them because it's this organization that talks about the skills of blindness in a way that no other organization does. And what makes the difference in independence is the skills of blindness, and that gets you through the more negative feelings about blindness into a more asset and positive orientation about blindness. How I define orientation and mobility. I define it simply as independent movement and travel. I think that's where they come together. Purposeful thought and purposeful movement coming together in independent movement and travel. And it has to do with the drive to move and the need to know. So I remember years ago working with a little girl in the old-fashioned kind of like classrooms that all had wooden floors and the old coat room in the back, you know, and her name was Rosie, and she was in kindergarten, and she was learning where a coat hook was, and her teacher of the blind, in many states called TVI, and in New Jersey as well, teacher of visually impaired, had put her Braille name along her coat hook. And that's where her coat hook was, so she would know that. But she wanted to know how could she, like, where was Raymond's coat hook? So I showed her how she could scan the wall to Raymond's coat hook, and that was Raymond's coat hook. And then she would scan back, find her coat hook. Well, Rosie repeated this process like 8 or 9 times, and finally I said, Rosie, you know, what gives is like, you know, almost half of our mobility lesson, you know. I said, why is it so important to find Raymond's coat hook? And she said, oh, well, he's my boyfriend. Aha. So I said, the drive to move. He said, that's the drive to move. Motivation. And the other piece is the need to know. So just to kind of underscore that, I remember working with Isabel, and she was a preschooler, and our lesson was being able to walk on the sidewalk in front of preschool and pass a driveway. And to learn how to pass a driveway and know when you're doing that and continue on the sidewalk. And there's certain skills and techniques to learn that. Midway, her shoelaces became untied. So I bent down, I said, Isabel, this is not a shoe tying lesson, so I'm going to bend down and tie your shoes so we can continue on our cane travel lesson. Now, I'm a bald-headed guy, and I'm a sighted guy. So I bent down to look at her shoelaces, and you can hear my voice going over below the table, and as I'm tying her shoes, these little hands came out forward and felt the top of my head. And she just said, oh, Mr. Joe, you don't have a face. And I said, aha, the need to know. And I said, Isabel, oh honey, I have a face, sweetheart, look. And as I lifted my face up to look at her, she could feel my nose, my eyes, and whatever, and then her comment was, oh, Mr. Joe, you have two faces. I said, no, it's one face. What you're feeling is a bald head. You have just never felt a bald head before. And so our responsibility is how to gather information. It's not about how much vision you have. It's do you have the information to make decisions, to develop good judgment, and be independent in your movement and travel. I'd like to tell a little bit about how I identify myself as a professional service provider. Years ago, I went to the home and knocked on the door of a parent whose child was blind, actually born with anophthalmos, the lack of eyes. And I introduced myself as I had been trained as the vision consultant. And after the door was open, I introduced myself. The parent said, thank you very much. My child was born without eyes. There's really no vision to consult, so have a good day. And closed the door. And I stood there and I thought about that. And then she opened the door and she said, I'm sorry, I really, it wasn't my intention to say that. I just been so turned off by what I've been reading and hearing, and it's all about vision and whether you have even a little light perception and the use of light boxes to promote light perception. And she said, what about touch and those skills? My child has got no sight. So I said, you're absolutely right. And that was like over 20 years ago. But what I learned from that is I never, ever use that expression, vision consultant, again. Because what I started to realize was I was a blindness consultant. And what I had to offer were the skills of blindness. You have your vision for what you can see and the skills of blindness for what you can't. So hopefully providing appropriate instruction and adequate instruction so that the children can learn in an age-appropriate or developmentally appropriate way. And the reason I'm just drawing that distinction is many of you know if a child is 2 years old, well, they should be performing on a 2-year-old level. And if a child is 6 but functioning at 2, well, they should be still learning at a 2-year-old level. So age or stage developmentally appropriate. Now, how do I identify the population I work with? Blind children, totally blind or legally blind, I refer to as blind children. When I think of the visually impaired population, now back in New Jersey, it was the Commission for the Blind and Visually Impaired, and the visually impaired population were those who had 20/70 vision or best in the better eye, and were not legally blind and were eligible for certain services, but not other services. So in some states, vision impairment has legal implications. I prefer just to refer to a child as blind or partially sighted because to me it seems a more accurate, neutral term and a way to express it. And I've learned that also, I think I first read partially sighted in an article by Barbara Cheadle, who is the parent president of the National Organization of Parents of Blind Children and puts out and edits Future Reflections, which there's a few copies on the table there. And she had written an article, Advice to Parents of Partially Sighted Children. And that's where I first read that phrase. And to me it seems so much more positive than the term visually impaired. I think it is okay to say blind. And the problem I have with person-first language, and person-first language goes something like this, because it's in most of the textbooks about visually impaired kids. And usually it's the visually impaired child or something like that. The B word is often avoided. Blind is often avoided. Now, what should we call the assessment that we use for blind children? Nationwide, probably the most common term given to the assessment is functional vision assessment. And after many years of using those assessments, because I'm also a certified teacher of the blind and visually impaired, I really came to the conclusion that it was inadequate, particularly in light of the parents saying my child has no eyes. So what kind of functional vision assessment are you going to do? When we take a closer look at the functional vision assessment, often the pages and pages, as in my state in New Jersey, had questions about Braille and cane. And so there were other areas of development that had nothing to do with vision. But yet there is this vision agenda, and there's this hierarchy that developed from post-World War II, made its way into the education of blind children, and it goes something like this. The more vision you have, the more skills you will have. The less vision you have, the less skills you will have. So functional vision assessment is setting up a vision-first agenda. I think it's more appropriate to refer to it as a functional skill assessment. The functional skills assessment does not negate or diminish the role vision may play in the child's development, but the use of the term functional vision assessment does put forth a vision-first agenda and places a negative light on the learning of the necessary skills of blindness, that the blind child must learn to be independent in movement and travel. Vision is one set of skills, one sensory system, which blind kids, by definition, if they're legally blind, can have no more than 10% of typical vision. If it's 20 over 200, 10%. And if they're totally blind, then they better have a lot of non-visual skills and techniques, because the vision agenda is really not going to move them forward. So that's a little bit about how I identify myself, identify the population, and identify the assessment. The orientation to blindness needs to be stated in more asset terms than deficit orientation terms. It's really not about vision loss. Vision loss dominated the scene, of course, after World War II, because those veterans did lose vision, and they lost vision in a traumatic way. That's not to say that there are children who were born and lose vision in their first year of life or in their second year of life. But a born blind child is not, and the born blind child is about gains in development. It's not about loss of vision. There's two concepts that I think help me to think this through. When I was in training, okay, as a sighted guy and under the sleep shades, and I used a cane, not the one that I just opened up that's up to my, nose, but a much shorter cane, I was taught as an adult to extend my arm, tap wider than my shoulders, left foot forward, cane to the right, right foot forward, cane to the left, in step rhythm. But as an adult, I took that information in my head and applied it to a new motor scheme with my hand. We can think of that as a top-down model, which means out of the concept comes the experience. With children, and very young children, it's bottom-up, which is out of the experience comes the concept. So little kids aren't going to understand the idea of extending their arm, and even those who are more precocious at early intervention or preschool and can get the idea, simply aren't able to fully extend their arm at that young. They often need to bend at the elbow, because occupational therapists, for example, tell us when you bend at the elbow, you isolate the movement to have more control over the movement of your arm. So that's just one example of looking at it from the bottom up as opposed to top down. Differences aren't deficits. They're just differences. And what it calls upon us is, okay, if at a certain age, this is what a blind child, a sighted child does, and they use vision to do it, what's the alternative non-visual skill for the blind child to do the similar task? So it calls upon us to have the alternative techniques from the bottom up, so that a 2 or 3 month old baby who's totally blind and hears a mother's voice or a father's voice, as blind babies will do, will turn in the direction of parents. The literature says that blind children babies don't turn in the direction towards sound. What happens is initially they do, because it's kind of wired in. When sighted babies turn in the direction of a mom's voice or a dad's voice, they get the payoff of mom or dad smiling at them, saying something to them. And then, so things to hear are things to see, mom and dad's face. What's the alternative technique for a blind baby? Things to hear as they turn becomes, let's facilitate the hand up to mommy or daddy's face. Let them nibble and kiss those fingers. Let the parent come and kiss the cheek, which is often what you parents have done. And if you have a baby, you are doing. But that's an alternative technique, because now things to hear are things to touch. And in early development, when two senses go together, they validate one another. So when the literature, this old literature says that blind children don't recognize parents as early, or they don't turn in the direction of sound, it's really about that they didn't get the alternative non-visual technique at that age or developmentally appropriate time. I have a blind friend who has been partially sighted much of his life. Over time has lost vision little by little. And over the years, as someone with low vision, he has often, pulled that paper up or looked very closely. When he walked, he did not learn using a cane, so his posture was over. He was tilting his head, using his vision to compensate for the downfield, whereas if your cane is sliding down, it frees you to look up and have better posture and use the vision you have. Again, cane for what you can't see, vision for what you can. And what happened recently, dramatically, this spring, which may have been related to his postural adjustments and constantly looking down, is 3 of his what they're called vertebrae in his neck decomposed, and put pressure on his nerve, central nervous system. And initially they thought he had a stroke, because in his left side of his body he had very little coordination and movement. And during this rehab process, the good news is my friend is now gone from no use to his left side to eating with tools. He can dial a phone now with his fingers on his left hand. Better use of his right, which was also involved a little. He went from a wheelchair to a walker, and now is using a support cane. But during this whole process, what he had to learn was he never learned non-visual techniques. So that in learning to light a candle, instead of looking really close and lighting it, he's going to touch it first to find the wick and bring the flame to near that and pull that. Okay, he's going to learn the non-visual techniques to complement what he doesn't see, and he's 65 years old. So it is never too late. And what drives that answer of being never too late is attitude. Attitude about blindness. Because many people lose their vision. And one of the hardest populations to work with is seniors who've had vision and being visually oriented all their life and now losing their vision, and they don't have the resiliency and energy of children who easily adapt, and teenagers who adapt. But even they, with really good attitude, can learn the skills. Independent Movement and Travel in Blind Children, a promotion model, a book I have written, is at the publishers and hopefully will be out in December. And in that we'll have this core philosophy and a number of photos for parents to look at as a testimonial to different approach. And I'll jump the gun with one point that I'm going to make a little later. In 65 photos in chapter 5, where I do the developmental kind of peek at what some of these skills look like, there's not one photo of the sighted guide or human guide. Because I think that is the most overused method of travel taught by my profession to blind, partially sighted, visually impaired children in how to ambulate about the environment. And I'll explain more a little bit about that later and why I think so. A parent who I've worked with, and I loved her, and I'm very, very fortunate to have worked many years with Carol Castellano in New Jersey. By the way, these handouts that are mine, but not all mine, I don't think. I'm not sure.
I think I only printed yours.
Okay. Are printed off from blindchildren.org, which Carol Castellano, as the parent president in New Jersey of Parents of Blind Children of the NFB, put together that website. And she has this book, Making It Work, and is the author of this, and is, I think it's out now, I think it's a full year, and for those students in the quote, regular school environment, I think this is indispensable. I think it's a really valuable book to think about purchasing. A great resource, I mention it now, if you haven't heard of Dr. Lily Nielsen. You need to, and the Lily Works, Lilly works.com, I think is, lilyworks.org and visionkits.com are two websites you can get her books. But she works very developmentally, and particularly under 36 months of age, with the delayed and multi-disabled blind child, visually impaired child. And she's really recognized internationally now as really the, I think, I would say the leader in addressing the active learning is her philosophy for these children. One of the main principles of the promotion model is simply this. What's essential is not vision, or how much vision you have. Because that can misguide parents in many ways. What's essential is observation. How is your child observing? With their hands, with their ears, echolocation, more subtle use of hands, and kinesthetic, kind of feeling on your face of the sound waves bouncing off of objects, the feeling of movement. Along that line, there are three things that might be said. One is, this is tough. It took me many years as a professional service provider. It's so simple. Why did it take me like over 25 years to get it? Vision is simply not a requirement for travel, and vision is not a requirement for life. There is a blindness model orientation. And as Dr. Richard Mettler has said in his book, Cognitive Learning Theory in Cane Travel, the visual model does not lay exclusive claim on skillful human development. That there is a blindness model as well. And at the NFB, we respect the vision you have and certainly promote the blindness model. Second point is about preview. How much preview do we have? Now, as vision, I have preview to the end of this room, visually. Someone with echolocation and tapping a cane might be able to tell the same dimensions of this room with me with vision, especially if the floor wasn't carpeted. But even in carpeted rooms, I've known blind folks who've been able to tell the general size of the room just by tapping it. Not with those, and here we go, I'm going to lay it out there, not with the clunky folding canes and those marshmallow rolling tips that roll over information, but those crisp, clear metal tip canes that have superior vibro-tactile resonance coming up the hollow shaft. Okay, so preview is what is important. And the third, I think, and when I say observation is the most important thing, why would I be so opposed to overusing the sighted guide or human guide for blind kids? And I don't mean just in school and getting about. I mean day to day, just moving about, whether it's down the hall in this convention. If your child knows how to use a cane, let them use it. Why are they walking on your arm? Here's why. As an adult, if I were to lose my vision right now, I would certainly want to, at times, have the option of using the sighted guide, human guide, or as this parent mentioned, and I started out with Carol Castellano and got sidetracked, but we were talking in her kitchen and we came up with this phrase, paired walking. It was her idea. And I said, yeah, when you actually think about it, that's all it is paired walking. Because often we walk together not for the purpose of even guiding one another, we're just walking together. So we want that option. But as an adult, I have had years as a visual adult of observing the world visually. If I were blind and I was taught from the bottom up to use the cane and very little human-guided or paired walking unless I chose it, I would have a lot of experience about the environment. Because here's what happens when you walk on the arm of another person. What you observe is their movement. You do not observe your own movement. And as Dr. Lily Nielsen has so aptly put, the essence of active learning, and in this case we're talking about active movement, is when the thought for movement comes from the child's brain, that's active. When the thought for movement comes from the adult's brain, that's passive. So when the child does not self-initiate and sustain and monitor and terminate their own movement, all that judgment is taken away from them and it's done by the adult. So whether we're talking about a 1-year-old beginning to explore, they need to be monitored just like any other child. Or whether we're talking about a 16-year-old child who's using the cane for the first time, or adult who's 62. You have that cane in hand, and you're self-initiating the movement, the thoughts coming from your brain, and you are the observer. You're observant. Observation is what is essential. That's probably the most important principle in the basic 3 principles of the promotion model. The second is, and I mentioned it before, every child, every individual has the need to know and the drive to move, to gather information. Blindness is simply not a cognitive disability. And if you have a blind child who is totally blind, partially sighted, visually impaired, however you want to, because what I'm offering you today is informed choice. I'm offering you information. And as parents and professional service providers, you take that into the information you know, and then you make decisions on it. I believe in informed choice. I do not believe, as a friend of mine in New Jersey would say, uninformed chance. So I'm not going to feed you just one point of view. I'm going to give you, hopefully, what is more of a spectrum of information. Blindness is simply not a cognitive disability. So often, if a blind child who already has one physical disability may have cerebral palsy, where it affects their motor movements in walking, or they're missing an arm, or they have, they're deaf, blind and deaf, dual sensory impairment. Dual sensory or dual physical impairments do not make a multi-disabled child. Multi-disabled children fall in the category often and are placed in a program of lower expectations. That's not true of all programs, but in general, that's the case. So that a child who may be partially sighted and neurologically impaired, it's the neurologic impairment that needs the educational placement, perhaps, plus the supplemental information about how do you work with a partially sighted child. But those two together do not equal a multi-disabled child, a multiple disabled child. There are many children, and I've worked with them, and early in my career, must say, I want to bury my head in the sand because I didn't advocate for them appropriately, because I didn't know better, who might have been blind, had another physical disability, and some oral motor problem, because they were all, that child was born at 23 weeks gestation, premature. But they were not cognitively disabled. And in the early intervention years of preschool, of birth to 3 or 3 to 5, it's so difficult to know at times, is this a cognitive disability or is it sensory or physical? And I will say to you, based on the historical textbooks, the blind child is behind the 8 ball to begin with, because it's often perceived as a cognitive disability to begin with. And it's not the child, it's us adults who do not know how to work with the child, particularly in the non-visual techniques. Yeah, so we need to kind of make that clear with the child study teams. So the goal is active movement and developing a perception of one's own self as an active movement and traveler. And the third point is, it is very reasonable to expect age and stage appropriate development from blind children when they've been given a menu of experiences that makes sense to them and is adequate and appropriate. Give you one example. I attended a workshop, two very capable professionals, PowerPoint presentations, and I, as a professional, was overwhelmed. I can only imagine a parent who might not know some of this information sitting there would think, God has just presented this information, okay? And the name of the workshop was The Impact of Blindness on Movement. Just from the title, we can get the sense of what most of the workshop was about. Well, the impact of blindness has a negative impact on movement. Child's fearful to move because they're blind. Child's fearful to get out of the sit position because they're not sure what's out there. All these erroneous assumptions. Because I say erroneous because all you have to do, and some of you know, because you have a typical developing blind child, is have one blind child from birth who did not have developmental delays, say particularly in motor development, and cognitively, given appropriate instruction, is just doing grade level. All you need is one to disprove the idea that blindness in itself will have a negative impact on motor development. So, after listening to this workshop, I was really frustrated. I went to our head of training, and fortunately, we were on the same page and danced at the same radio station and all that. So I said, Sandy, you got to let me do a workshop. And she said, okay, what do you want to call it? I said, what we're going to call it is the effects of movement, the importance of movement and the effects of movement on development. You see, because when that becomes the focus, then we can say there are critical areas in motor development of children. And it's those components of movement in those critical areas that we want to make sure blind children have. And if they don't, and they miss that component of movement, like as if babies, they're not pushing up off the floor in prone and lifting up their head, because the conventional research will say, oh, well, they don't have the vision to motivate them to do that. That's not true. Blind babies will do that, especially when mom and dad lay on the floor and they're the ground, and the babies are pushing off of their chest. That's very motivating to babies. So that's an alternative technique. And so what it becomes is, it's the missing components of movement causes a delay in motor development, not blindness. You see how we shift the emphasis here? Because if we make blindness the reason the child is going to, say, walk late and not within the typical norm of children, we're setting parents up that they're at a dead end. That's what we're setting them up for. But if we say that it's a missing component of movement that needs to be addressed, well, physical therapists can work on that, occupational therapists, the parent can work on that with them, and we need to know the alternative skills. Because most therapists, unless they've been trained in blindness, are only working on what they know from the visual point of view. So we need to educate them regarding that. Is there, before we do that, since we have like 2 minutes or something, is there any burning question before we break?
Can I please
Sure.
ask just one question? You were talking about suppressed movement. Does that cause rocking?
Yes.
Is that where it comes from?
Yeah. In fact, there are many blind children who are misperceived as autistic or autistic-like because they rock or have what's called other motor mannerisms or perceptive behaviors. The result of it has often been that they've been restricted in their movement. And the more general response to that is whenever we restrict the movement of a person, we restrict their freedom. So that for hundreds of years, when the feet of Chinese girls were bound so that they would be smaller, it also was the purpose of restricting the speed in which they could walk, and therefore restrict their freedom. When blind kids haven't been given canes for decades until they're older, we've restricted their freedom because we restricted their movement. When we give them pre-cane devices that slow them down when they could use a regular cane and speeding up, we're delaying and restricting movement. So absolutely. What happens is children, as I said before, have the drive to move. And if you restrict that drive to move, they're going to move their own body. They're going to rock, they're going to poke. The more you give them to do and the more movement, the less you're going to see that kind of motor mannerisms behavior.
Well, would that be just categorized as blindisms?
No, it used to be. And it's now thought of as motor mannerisms because we see the same, it's an excellent question, we see the same behavior and often disturbed behavior because it can interrupt learning in the autistic and in kids with other pervasive developmental disorders. And that's why very young blind children are misdiagnosed as thinking, oh, there's something cognitively going on here because, you know, they're these motor mannerisms. Ignoring the fact that maybe this blind baby was born at 23 and a half weeks and stayed in the hospital for 4 months and had all the normal movement patterns that they would do, like when you're born, you're folded up like a little flower and you gradually unfold, then you bring your hands to midline, start discovering your chest and reaching out. And that's disturbed in the prematurity event. It's not blindness that causes the delay, it's the prematurity event that causes the delay. And so how do we work with the blind baby to ensure that they, at each stage of that motor development, their needs are being addressed? And that refers to the points I made earlier with the alternative techniques of blindness from the bottom up. So yeah, it's not a blindism. If it's a motor mannerism, and now I think the more prevalent, maybe someone can help me out here, I think is stereotypical pattern. But I love Dr. Lily Nielsen because what she'll say is, but like in her Danish kind of like comments, how is that different from some of us professional service providers who do the same things over and over and over, and the children don't learn, and it never occurs to us, maybe we should change what we're doing. Because if we don't change what we're doing, we're assuming the child is unteachable. And we must always assume that the child is teachable, and often in a different way. And that's what the NFB is about, is showing the options in non-visual ways that are different from just the visual options. So I'll kind of pick off where I left off, and there was a couple of questions posed to me during lunchtime, and I think one of them kind of helped me to kind of think about another way of putting some of the information I did this morning, because one of the main points we made this morning is that the most important thing is observation, that the blind child has observation of their environment. And vision is not a requirement for travel, it's not a requirement for life. If you have vision and use it efficiently, you certainly don't want to disregard that, but that you have your vision for what you can see and you have the cane for what you can't. You have the non-visual techniques for what you can't. But it brought to mind when someone asked me about a problem with with rocking, and then a little bit further during lunchtime. And it seems to me that before we get into some information about the cane travel, is that there are 3 systems in understanding space in general terms for the child, as us as human beings, for pulling space together and making sense out of it. One is our visual system, one is our vestibular system, and one is our touch system. Now, our visual system, when it comes to the field of blindness, has been put forth with the Vision First agenda as our most important system. And we know from what we talked about this morning that that was challenged, and that it is not the most important system. And certainly, if you're totally blind, it's not a system at all to be used. So the Vision First agenda kind of promotes that to the point that, say, working with light training activities and light boxes would be put first before a child's tactile touch search pattern. Because things to touch may be things to see if you have vision to see it. But we certainly don't want a child's hands to be told, be put under the table, look first, and then once you see it, reach with your hand. That would be the unnatural sequence, but yet that's what's sometimes promoted when it comes to the vision first agenda. So the second system, the vestibular system, is where the impact of severe prematurity comes in. And often it's blindness that gets the bad rap as the cause of all the delays in motor development, particularly when it's not blindness in itself, it's in the missing components of movement that are the result of the prematurity event. Because when you were born at 23.5 weeks or 25 weeks gestation, the motor development is compromised and delayed. So we need to address that, and we need to address it in ways sometimes that are non-visual so that the child, the baby in this case, is going to develop those missing components of movement. Then we get to the sense of touch. My case that I put forward is touch is our most important system. It's the oldest system in evolutionary terms. It's the system in the baby when born full term is the most mature at birth, and in the baby who's born premature is also the most mature at birth. In evolutionary terms, vision was really a Johnny-come-lately in this sense to be used. And even if we take evolution away from it, how about this story? Dr. Renee Spitz did studies of babies in foundling institutions after war. And those babies that were, their parents had died and they were now taken care of in foundling institutions. And those babies that were fed and nurtured and held and supported and were touched survived. Those babies that were not given the touch and the nurture withered away. And the phrase marasmus was developed, the withering away. So we know that we can survive without vision. Certainly, blind persons are proof positive of that. And we can survive successfully. Certainly, blind persons with the skills of blindness are proof positive of that. Surviving without our sense of touch is much more problematic. So, why do I make a point of that? In that when we're working with blind children from the bottom up, we want to make sure that their experiences are rich in the menu of what we offer them in touch experiences, because that's the intact sense. The sense of vision is their less intact sense, depending on the severity of their visual loss. Getting into cane travel, one thing I think we need to keep in mind when professional service providers like myself go into a home, go into a school, and we are, quote, the authority supposedly on orientation and mobility. And one thing we need to keep in mind is that there is no assessment based on early childhood O&M that's been proven through research to be accurate. I mean, there are assessments out there, and probably one of the first ones ever, an inventory, was the Oregon Project that was developed from the School for the Blind and is still used today. And Texas School for the Blind has a number of assessments, and the Division of Vision 9 and AER in O&M has assessments. But the bottom line is they're not validated with blind children. So, they're opinions, okay? And we also need to keep in mind that no O&M program in the country has a specialization in early childhood O&M. There's no additional certification for an O&M instructor who wants to specialize in children. So I just want to mention because when it comes then to that mobility instructor starts to work with your child and hopefully with you and communicates with you as well, that you keep that in mind, because it's where you can get information. And again, we talked about informed choice this morning. You get the information, you get informed, you make the choice. What you don't want is uninformed chance. If the mobility instructor you're working with has no idea the longer cane approach to travel, which we'll get into this afternoon, or the lighter cane approach to travel, and they just have negative comments to make about it, then they're down on something they're not up on. And as a professional, we need to understand the differences in different approaches and different characteristics of the cane. So, it's interesting to note that many folks who use the longer cane approach to travel do so because they've had experience with the shorter cane approach. And it's interesting to note that those who use the shorter cane approach to travel have not had experience, or if they've had, it's been a negative experience taught by persons who don't know some of the alternative skills to use in teaching the longer cane approach. There are a few systems that are used in teaching cane travel by all mobility instructors. First comes what the conventional approach is pre-cane skills. And part of pre-cane skills is the sighted guide or human guide. And we talked this morning about the problem for that for blind children. Once again, I have no problem with the option of a guided technique being used by someone as an option for travel. The problem I have is when it's given to blind children as the main way of moving about and is overused, because what they're observing is someone else's movement, not their own movement. That's the point made this morning. The second is what I would call, there's three approaches to cane travel. There's the no cane approach, and some folks shared this morning that although they are visually impaired or legally blind, there are times they don't use a cane, and sometimes they do. So there's a no cane approach to travel, there's the shorter cane approach to travel, and there's the longer cane approach to travel. Then is dog guide travel, and then electronic devices, such as global positioning system, laser cane, MOA, different electronic devices used and taught by professional service providers. The cane is a handheld tool. It's a protector, detector, and previewer. It gets feedback from the environment, and then the traveler gives feed forward of what to do with the cane. It's meant to be a contact tool for mobility. So when I hear kids say, oh, I hit someone, and try to change the language a little bit like, well, unless they really did swing and hit someone, and that's another issue. Just like a sighted child throwing a pencil at somebody, that's a behavior issue. That's not a skill of blindness issue. You know? But when you're just sliding your cane and you taps into someone's foot or side of the leg, you've contacted them, you've got information, and then you can base that to either slow down, go around, speed up, whatever the information gives you. So it's a previewer, and it gives feedback and you give feed forward. And it's a contact tool for mobility. For a totally blind child, it's a no vision aid. And if we want to serve the visual model, we can say it's a low vision aid. It looks down so the traveler can look up. Certainly a cane that is too short for the traveler is going to create an inappropriate posture, an inappropriate normalized gait. So for years when the research said that blind children work with everted feet out and constricted upper trunk and slightly hunched over, it was really talking about children who weren't afforded the opportunity of normalizing their gait with a long cane, because that's certainly the best way to normalize the gait in a blind child. An inappropriate travel tool will result in inappropriate gait patterns. Sleep shades are not about vision. The use of sleep shades are about learning non-visual skills. So if I wanted to teach vision, the last thing I do is put sleep shades on a child. And if I wanted to teach non-visual skills, the first thing I do would be put sleep shades on the child. And add to that every orientation and mobility specialist or travel instructor, whatever program or agency training they went to, learned under full occlusion. And yet the larger profession seems to have a problem with affording the same opportunity to blind individuals using sleep shades, because they talk in jargon terms of adjustment to vision loss and emotional issues about being sleep shaded and that kind of thing, which really smacks at the idea that it's not okay to be blind, especially totally blind. And if you take all your vision away, it's going to be such a frightening experience that you're not going to be able to fully integrate the skills that you learn, when the opposite is true. What I've learned from the National Federation of the Blind is that orientation and mobility is a confidence-based skill. And the way you develop your confidence in learning cane travel is non-visually, through the use of sleep shades. To me, the ultimate proof positive that sleep shades work is the congenitally blind, born blind child with no vision who, given the opportunity for adequate and appropriate instruction, becomes a full participant in life and learns as his sighted peers to take on growing and more and more growing independence. Because from day one they have sleep shades on. So, hello, we know sleep shades work, end of the debate. What is the precursor to using a cane? Well, the conventionally trained profession is still promoting alternate mobility devices, or what sometimes is called pre-cane devices. Okay. I've experimented with them. I've been in the field for over 35 years. I tried them. I tried a variety of different types of canes and pre-cane devices. And the bottom line is, I believe it's a misguided application of erroneous readiness criteria that delays the use of cane in favor of a device that is two-handed, so you push it, heavier, slows down the child, limits range of motion and movement, limits precision in the use of the travel tool, encourages push behavior. So, for example, one pre-cane I have right here, and I'll pass it around. This one's the size almost of a baseball. I don't know, I don't really follow sports that much, but it looks to me like maybe it's a little bit less than a regular hardball. Yeah, it is. But the point I want to make is, the problem I have with roller tip canes is that they roll. And the problem I have with these really fat ones is that they, and the marshmallow tip ones, is that they roll over information versus the metal tip canes, which give more precise, exact information about the tactile surface of the ground. It's much easier to find the sidewalk and the slope of a driveway and the edge between the two with a metal tip cane than it is a roller tip cane.
These are pre-cane devices, did you say?
No, I kind of jumped forward to, I'm holding a roller tip cane. But the point I want to make is this, I'm going to might as well just pass this around, this roller tip cane. That the pre-cane devices are used with two hands. So, a rectangular shaped PCV pipe construction where the bottom has an additional piece of plastic threaded through it so it rolls. And the traveler would hold it and slide it forward and push it. And it's wider than their shoulder. That has become the alternate mobility device of choice to introduce before the cane. The problem with that is when you're going up steps, for example, you have to put it over your shoulder. Up and down curbs, it does not navigate curbs as safely, so therefore it will slow you down. Also, by pushing it, your right and left hand are in the same position with a symmetrical movement pattern, arms out, pushing straight. In working with any occupational or physical therapist with a blind child, some of you have heard that what we're shooting for is asymmetrical movement. The left hand does one thing while the right hand does another. The simple function of a cane in one hand promotes that. So there are issues that are problematic with the pre-cane device, and I go back to one of my first statements when I said there's no assessment that's been validated based in early childhood O&M, no certification in it, and although there's been some, quote, more than questionable, I would say lame research that has been put out there in some journals on the use of pre-canes, when you look at the numbers in the subjects of their research and what was considered success and not, it really becomes highly questionable as to the use of it. So what is the precursor? If there's any precursor to a cane, I would consider the precursor to the cane to be the spoon. Because it's a handheld tool and it's used in small space. And as blind kids learn the daily living skills in an age and stage appropriate way in life, they learn to use their hands and learn to use tools. And the long cane will be among the progression of tools to be used and will be the most important tool for previewing and navigating the environment with any other single tool in their life. Characteristics of the cane. I think we need to understand more about, and I certainly did in my experimenting with kids and canes, what are the characteristics of the cane? Their composition. What is the cane's composition? Its weight. What is the tip made out of? The grip. How flexible it is. What is the length of the cane? The kind of resonance it performs, if it affords or doesn't. So, what I'm going to do is show two canes. One cane in my hand is an NFB type cane 2, I think. Maybe not 2. It's carbon fiber, this one happens to be. It doesn't have to be. And it's a telescopic cane, which I wouldn't suggest as the child's first cane.
And adults either.
Because, sometimes if you're walking, you know what happens. It may telescope in on you
Closes up.
and whatever. And so if you're, as a child with reaction time, you haven't learned that quite yet. But anyway, this cane kind of goes up to my forehead. And what is the length on this cane? It's 67 inches. Now, I was trained in a 48-inch cane. And just to not stack up the cards in an unfair disadvantage, this is a 50-inch cane that I just unfolded, okay? And what I'm going to do is just try to simply demonstrate the developmental reasons why the longer cane approach to travel makes sense. I'm approaching it purely from a developmental perspective for children. So, when I was taught to use the cane, I was taught, remember this morning we talked about top-down? Out of the concept comes the experience. That's the adult-centered model. That's the post-World War II medical, hospital, Veterans Administration model. That was developed by sighted guys. The blind guys were developing their own model, but they weren't brought into this kind of conventional approach. Okay, so I've extended my arm. I was taught that. I've got my pointer finger on the flat part. I'm going lateral, side to side, doing a touch technique. And then I learned left foot out, cane to the right. Right foot out, cane to the left. Now, let's see what I'm going to do here. I'm trying to think of the best way to view this for the camera that's on. But I'm going to just basically walk up to a wall in step. Full extension out, trying to do perfect technique. Left foot out, cane to the right. I hit the wall, I've got one full step, and maybe another inch, but I've got one full step protection. Now the fun begins. Now I'm someone who isn't quite comfortable, or I'm a child perhaps, and I can't extend my arm, because when I do, I have such an exaggerated with the cane, it becomes the McDonald's arch. Or I love to hammer. And I want to do constant contact because that's what we're taught first. And I have no problem with constant contact as the first technique. Because often adults use it to slide their cane constantly if they're picking up a curb or something, they're looking for more information, right? But what kids do, and often adults do, is bend at the elbow and bring that cane in so that when they pull back and their elbow is almost on their side, and by bending at the elbow, what they've done subconsciously is controlled the movement from their elbow to their hand. So they have more control over the cane. Now I'm doing that with this cane. And now I'm going to walk left foot out, cane to the right, in step. I hit the wall, and my foot does not fully go one full step. I've lost about a half a step protection. Now, I'm a child or an adult who, for developmental reasons or preference, hold a cane back. But again, once again, the child's doing it for developmental reasons. I've got the conventional length, even a little longer. Sorry to say, I've seen precious little blind kids with canes that are not even higher than their belly button. You know, so you can imagine the disadvantage that that's even going to give them there. And now I'm going to walk out of step. Left cane out, cane's going to be on the left, because a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5-year-old blind child is not capable of walking in step. Now, I did work with a precocious blind child once who learned in-step rhythm at 4 years of age. The problem is, as soon as he hit an object, he would get out of step and then wouldn't get in it, or so much brain power was needed to concentrate on in-step, he wouldn't listen to other things in the environment, like maybe in a car approaching, you know. So when it comes to really integrating and neurodevelopmentally figuring it all out, we're really talking about grade school kids. So now I'm out of step, okay? Now I'm to the point of out of step that I'm about 2 or 3 inches from this wall, and I don't even have, well, I have 2 or 3 inches with my next step. I better have the reaction time to stop on a dime. Blind kids are developing reaction time. They don't have that reaction time. Now the longer cane. When I first was experimenting with a longer cane approach, I didn't know about the NFB. I didn't know they had these canes. Why is that? Well, being conventionally trained and a supervisor, basically he gave us a budget of getting these, you know, folding canes that were the cheapest on the market. And we also had the Mahler cane with a handle, aluminum, and that was good because we could cut it down, and at least it was hollow, unlike the folding canes that have elastic going down the shaft. And hello, let's dampen the resonance to diminish echolocation for the blind child. Isn't that a good thing? So I was trained, you know, with the idea of the shorter cane approach, and I wanted a longer cane approach for the developmental reasons I just gave, because I thought a longer cane would compensate for 3 things: lack of extension, and because you're pulling the arm in, and then not having the in-step rhythm, and just learning about reaction time. So what I used were car antennas. I would go out and buy like the old telescoping, old-fashioned car antennas, and I would telescope them long enough out, duct tape them closed, and then they were so tiny that they would fit in the smallest hand. Well, that seemed to be functional just to experiment and see if lighter and longer worked, which it helped with, but of course the tip of those canes weren't very safe. The tip of the antennas, you know. But it got me thinking. And then in 1990, going to my first state convention, the NFB, I got introduced to a world of people who were using these longer canes. You know, like this alternate reality going on at the same time. You know, I'm like, why didn't I quite know about that? Okay. So now I became more informed. So now here's what happens when I go full extension with my arm with this longer cane. I'm going to walk in step. I hit the wall at 1, 2, just about 3 steps protection. If I'm pulling back and working, bending my elbow, as I said, often kids do and many adults do because it's more comfortable. And in fact, I'm using this what's called open palm position that I learned through the NFB, or I could be using it in what's called a pencil grip, which is another technique that goes along with the lighter, longer cane approach. But I'm pulling it back, and I'm walking in step. 1, and a little bit more protection. This time I'm going to pull back, I'm going to walk out of step, cane to the left as I step to the left. So I've got the most minimum protection. And I still have 1 foot, and then my second foot hits. Those are some of the developmental reasons why it makes sense to have the longer cane approach to travel. This is not about a political statement. This is not about feelings about a cane, which are some of the reasons given by conventionally trained instructors about what are these long canes in the Braille monitor when you see this cane so tall up alongside a person. What are they trying to say about that? It's such a misguided and erroneous assumption. Everyone has the right to be proud of who they are. But when it comes to the length of the cane, it's about the tool and the job that is getting done. And it's just logical and developmentally sound. So that is some of the principles I have. Now back to the developmental reasons for the longer cane. And what I want to get back to on the folding cane and the push cane is, I talked before about pre-cane devices which are pushed. My main concern is that in transitioning from the pre-cane device to the long cane, many instructors delay that because they're not sure if the child has the hand functioning or motor skill to handle the longer cane. And so the child just stays with the pre-cane device for a longer period of time. But then finally, when they're given a cane, what kind of cane are they given? They're given a folding marshmallow tip cane that basically, what is it that you do with it? Push. So what we have is a generation of blind kids who are learning to push canes. And the two-point touch is not performed as readily because these canes are heavier. And if you get, this cane is 50 inches, and now we take this 50-inch cane and we add it to, next to it is the 67-inch cane that I used. And if you make this 50-inch cane a 67-inch cane with a marshmallow tip, folding cane with elastic going down it, and you try to do two-point touch with it, you're going to feel the difference in your wrist. So what you have is kids rolling canes, not necessarily walking in step with two-point touch, and not necessarily walking with the speed in which they could have walked with a lighter cane. So I'm just going to pass around at the same time. You can feel the weight difference between the 50-inch and the 67-inch cane. Question?
Well, my daughter has both of the canes, and she prefers the fold cane. But you also have mobility teachers that prefer one cane over another.
Right.
Now, Chelsea doesn't like the tall cane. She doesn't like the
Right.
So shouldn't we go along with preference, or should we kind of push the issue with the long cane?
Well, I think the kind of question you're asking is, what does logic tell you from what I just demonstrated?
Well, the white cane would be a better one.
Yeah. What if I was an eye doctor and I said to you, I can restore Chelsea's vision to 2 feet, or I could restore it to 4 feet. But that was your choice. I mean, your answer might be, I don't want her to have any vision because she, and I can understand that. But if I basically gave you a choice of having preview at 2 feet or 4 feet, what would you want? 4 feet, yeah. And that's essentially what it comes down to, is preview. Why would we put a child at a disadvantage, especially a deaf-blind child, who relies on touch more than any other sense, and we're going to give them a folding cane that's going to dampen vibrotactile feedback? I want to show a sequence because there are a couple of parents here with this concept of a teaching cane. And the teaching cane is when you have the parent using the cane and the child is in front of the parent holding on to the cane and introduced to the cane for the first way through that. Did you have questions, Dr. Miller?
I wonder if you teach kids to run.
Absolutely. Yes, and it's really, it's a good thing when they run with their cane. In fact, there's also, like just the freedom of running at times without your cane, I suppose. But I know a number of kids in grade school, we make a game out of when kids play tag, that a blind kid would run, and when they touched you with your cane along your leg, you were it. They tagged you.
Yeah, my 4-year-old runs with her cane.
Uh-huh.
We have races when I pick her up from school. She'll say, "Mark, get that, go," and we head off.
But most blind children are afraid to run. There's a hesitation. My daughter's afraid to run.
Okay.
She's falling on her face.
Okay. And there's ways to run with with someone or holding onto a rope. No. Yeah. One way I kind of think is, like between two trees or two posts, you have like a rope. And you thread that rope through like a juice can, a cylinder can, you pop both ends out, where the child, and you assure the child that there's nothing in between the two spaces, but the tree at both ends. And then the child can slide that cane and go as fast as, go as fast as or slow as they want to get that feeling in the movement. And running's very important because you get that reciprocal motion. By the way, I forgot to mention earlier that when a child is not crawling, blind child is not crawling and there are some delays in that area, one of the best ways to develop the components of movement for crawling is to teach them to crawl up stairs. So some children who won't crawl on a floor will crawl upstairs when motivated by a parent's voice, a favorite activity, maybe they love the bath time, whatever. But crawling upstairs gets most of the components of movement, and also something called hippotherapy, where the child is on the horse, and often hippotherapy, if operated by an occupational or a physical therapist, will be paid by the insurance company. Because horses have the three components of movement that people do. Weight shifting, left to right, hip rotation, and reciprocal movement. So being on a horse, the child who's developmentally delayed gets the feeling of the three components of movement in a way that's fun and natural. And a good occupational therapist can transfer that into other activities. Question?
For what it may be worth, I've run with my cane and without, and it's much better with it. I don't run into so much stuff.
Right.
You don't develop good judgment without experience.
Right.
And you develop good judgment through some bad experiences. And if we don't let blind kids have experiences, who has the good judgment? We do.
That's right.
And they believe that it's the adults who have the judgment, and therefore they can't do that. They have to wait, so it creates kind of a passive learned helplessness. I'm going to ask Al to help me out here, because most folks are familiar with the conventional pointer finger lateral movement, but if Al could kind of just maybe we'll talk about like pencil grip, and maybe how you use that, or is the open palm familiar to you?
That's what we teach.
Yeah, I think the group would love to hear that, and because then we're going to be breaking for any parents who want to experiment some of this with it. And you'll see the difference, because if you're holding the cane in a pencil grip, it's not going to get you in your gut.
Right.
Or even lower, which hurts even more. So, or hurts me even more. So there you go, Al.
That's thank you, Joe. Another reason for the longer cane, it's easier to do the pencil grip actually. If I had a shorter cane, the pencil grip would still poke me. I've got actually what we call two pencil grips. And we call it pencil grip because I'm gripping it like you hold a pencil kind of. If you were writing, I'm left-handed by the way. And I've got it in a straight up and down motion if I'm in a real crowded area, such as the state fair, or when we're all trying to crowd out of the room at the same time. And I'm still going to move it left to right, shoulder width, to protect. One of the things that we talk about is having the cane clear the way before you take the step. I don't just take off walking, because that didn't do, even though I got a cane, it didn't do me no good. I clear the way before I step. And even with the pencil grip, I still do the left to right type of motion. So I'm clearing before I take my step to the right. I'm stepping left, but I'm clearing my right side. Now I'm clearing my left side. See? And then we have what I call a modified grip, which is another reason to have the longer white cane. I'll slide my hand back up a little bit, and I'm not holding in the open palm like I would out on the sidewalk, say, but I'm holding it at a more of an angle like this, which is great. I use that around the hotel quite a bit actually, because I'm going like this, and I don't know when I'm going to run into the crowd, but when I do, I can move immediately up to this. Like say you're standing there, and I come up and I feel you by the heel. I can immediately adjust up and then go accordingly. So it's a real easy transfer to, from what I call the extended or modified pencil to the close-up or some people call it crowded area technique, I guess is what I was taught originally. What do we call it?
More
It's called
vertical.
pencil grip, yeah. But at a training center in Minneapolis, we're an NFB training center up there at Blind Incorporated. What Joe is showing you here is exactly what we do. My job at the center there is to give tours, do outreach, and I listen to our travel instructor, and I think he must have recorded you because he says exactly what Joe was talking about. When people are taking a tour and they've got these little canes, and he shows them our cane, and they go, whoa, and he explains, and he puts it in their hand and shows them why, and as he sums it up, he says it all gets down to safety. That's the bottom line. So,
Al, for us who can't see how you're holding that, are you holding it with the pencil grip off to the side or still in the middle?
I keep it in the center at all
Okay,
times.
always in the center, okay.
Always in the center.
Just wasn't sure when you're starting to talk about a pencil grip.
Okay.
If you were
I
off
hold
to the
it-
side or what.
I'm sorry, yeah, I hold it like a pencil,
Uh-huh.
and I hold it in
But
the
it's still
center of my
centered.
body.
Okay.
And if I can hold it completely vertical, still doing the left to right motion. And then I can extend it out a little ways. And because the cane is longer, I can slide my hand up the handle a little bit. And it's still the pencil grip, but yet it's extended out a ways. And when that tip comes into contact with something, it's a natural, as I'm walking towards it,
Okay, wonderful.
it's a natural step to the vertical position.
And that's the way you run. You run with it held in the pencil grip.
I learned, well, we teach both techniques because there's three situations where I'm going to use, I'm out walking on the sidewalk or running. I do run once in a while. I should run more. I use the open palm up grip, the loose, back and forth tapping, as Joe was talking about. But when I am in the hotel here, very, very frequently, I'm in the what I call the modified pencil, where I've got it in the pencil style grip, but it's extended out in front of me, because I can react to the crowd or the people that I run up to more quickly.
And what Al has done with his hand, depending on, he can slide that hand down as far as he wants on that shaft. So the bottom line is you can always make a longer cane shorter. You can't make a shorter cane longer.
Right.
If you're dealing with if you're someone dealing with the New York City subway system, I think you're going to want another foot protection. So you might really want a little more extension. If you're really crowded area, you're going to bring that here maybe further down. Or if you're a child, learning to walk in a line in school, the most typical reason given about the longer cane approach is, oh, it gets right in between the legs of the other kids, it trips kids, it's very dangerous. No, you just hold that cane further down the shaft. And for the kids who don't know how to use the pencil grip, you just hold it further down the shaft in the conventional way of holding it. That's all. And now you've shortened it up. Same thing going up steps. I've known of an instructor who introduced the longer cane approach by holding the cane all the way at the top. So when the child went up the step, they tripped over their own cane. Common sense is you bring your hand further down the shaft. For very young kids, you can put a little Velcro marker where they have to hold it. That way, when they go up the steps, they don't trip over their own cane. So we're not talking about rocket science. We're talking about negative attitudes about a different approach. A very experienced, knowledgeable guy, Doug Boone, right? Came to New Jersey. He offered a training for consumers and another training for each office for staff. It was interesting that every staff who wanted to know the longer cane approach took advantage of it. But guess what? One group did not. The O&M group. They refused it. Now, there's a question whether they should have refused it or whether been permitted to refuse it, but they did. So I and one other instructor were the only two instructors who took the training. And Doug was thoughtful and sensitive enough to say, co-teach it with me. And still they were resistant to that. And as a person who I respect once asked me, her name is Dr. Joanne Wilson, she had said to me, do you think if these canes said AT&T, people would more readily buy them as opposed to NFB? And when it comes to the profession, I have to say, yeah. If it was AT&T, you'd phone home and say, gee, I'm going to buy one, Being NFB, there is still among a substantial number of the conventionally trained profession, because it comes from the top down, the conventional university programs, which is there's only one program that's different, and that's Louisiana Tech. that whose basic staff at the top is changing, but nevertheless the common message is beware of this consumer organization. You know, and as I said earlier today, it's easier to personalize it than get into head-to-head logical discussion of the issues, because when they do that, they're on terra infirma about the issues. Yeah. So their training is being offered, but it's not always being accepted.
And when you only have an O&M teacher to go by to teach your child how to use a cane, you're going to agree with the teacher.
Mm-hmm.
And when the teacher says, I prefer...
Well, the child does. And this is where I think parents need to be careful, particularly of partially sighted kids who are teenagers, when we leave it up to the kid to decide whether they want to use a cane or not. Parents would not leave it up to the kids whether you need glasses or not, or braces or not.
Right.
Although my father asked me years ago if I wanted braces, I said no, so he saved a few $1,000s. But anyway, the point is that you don't leave that up. But yet, when it comes to canes and kids, especially preteens or teenagers, we often kind of leave it up to them. And of course, their peer pressure, they're going to often say no. So if we can get in there early enough, and also write it into, I don't want to forget this, thank you for asking the question, into the IEPs. For example, if your child is working with an occupational therapist, if the OT knows that someday there will be something called a pencil grip, that OT is going to want to work with these 3 fingers particularly, and the fingers that are used to work a pencil. And they'll do different activities with the child to promote prehension, hand skills, finger skills, with the fingers that will use this. Or, and the last example I'll give, in the conventional approach where the pointer finger is out and it's going lateral, a lot of folks, and a lot of seniors, for example, with wrist involvements, and a lot of diabetics with circulatory problems, and a lot of children with strength issues, this lateral approach simply is a lot to expect and walk in step. With the open palm position, all I'm doing is moving this cane back and forth with 4 fingers. I'm not even using my thumb. And it's very low impact on the wrist. So there are so many advantages to the characteristics of this cane. The bottom line is, any cane's better than no cane. But if you're going to have a cane, choose one that puts you at an advantage, and choose one with the characteristics that put you at the most advantage. And I believe, and we believe here at NFB, if you get all the information about the characteristics of the cane, you'll make the best decision for yourself.
When the cane was being developed, was there research done that...
Yeah, it was developed, in fact, Dr. Maurer, correct me, but I believe the cane was developed not only by blind persons, but a blind engineer. And in fact, I don't know, I forget Lloyd's last name, but Rasmussen or whatever, but I remember the cane tip, him explained to me how it's encased in rubber for a particular reason and how it rotates so that it gives excellent echolocation potential. It just wasn't put together without research, but the opposite, I could then throw back to the conventionalists, like, where was your research? And what was it on as far as developing the shorter cane approach?
I have a telescopic cane in my suitcase. I carry it with me wherever I go. I never use it, but if something were to happen to this cane that I've got here, I need something to back it up. But we'll also take it, if we're going to go bike riding, like we have tandem bikes at the school, and we're going to go bike riding, we're going to get off the bikes and go do some stuff. This cane is a little difficult to strap onto the bike. It's not impossible, but the telescoping is appropriate for that or horseback riding.
This is a video sequence of a video that I put together. I'm narrating it, and it starts off with the idea of a teaching cane. Anthony is being held by his mother. She is holding a long cane. She invites him to hold the cane and move it and tap it as she is also exploring the possibilities. It's the most natural thing for the parent to be the child's first mobility teacher. I am Anthony's mobility instructor, and we are doing a mall walk. He is learning to hold his cane and scan the objects in the environment and learn what the possibilities of the long cane are. The longer cane approach to travel affords this possibility of Anthony holding on to my teaching cane, a strategy I learned from blind travel instructors who use a cane, of course, most naturally in their own travel. Here he is enjoying guiding my teaching cane. Gradually, he reinspects his own cane and begins to explore, holding it, tapping it, sliding it on the floor for his own self-amusement and exploration. He is self-monitoring his own independent movement and travel. This toddler is enjoying a mall walk at the National Federation of the Blind cane walk. His mother looks on and is unobtrusively available and sharing the experience with him. The longer cane approach here affords the mother the opportunity to hold a cane and guide it as her son holds on to the cane also and shares the experience and gradually takes over more and more of his own control for the cane. This toddler is enjoying walking on carpet and sliding the cane and being among a crowd in the reception area of the hotel at the National Federation of the Blind Convention. This little boy is enjoying scanning a wall, using his cane, sliding on the floor, feeling the tiles, and generally discovering his environment. Okay, I was going to go a little further on that, but I'm just trying to do the essence of each. This is a video of okay, I'm messing it up already. It should be okay. Brett and Katie. Brett's 2.5. He's the first child on the video, and then Katie is 3, and both have an additional factor impacts upon their development, which may be cognitive in nature. One has Leber's amaurosis, and the other has microphthalmos.
Go to Joe's room and you'll find your cane.
He's 2.5.
There's Joe's room.
And that's his occupational therapist. It's a program in
Did you find it?
St. Louis, Missouri, called Delta
Did you
Gamma,
find your cane?
early intervention, birth to 3. Finally, he kicks the cane with his foot, and he hears the sound, and that's how he finds it.
You found it!
Picks it up.
Hi. You want to go to the motor room and get on the slide? You found it! Let's go to the motor room and get on the slide. Gotta go this way. Let's go to the motor room. Put it in front. Let's go to the motor room.
Tapping the cane, that's the metal tip cane.
Fix your cane, Brett.
After visiting this program for 3 days, they had no mobility instructor assigned to them. So they wanted information, and afterwards,
Lori's office.
the staff went and purchased NFB type canes and started to give them to the kids. And I call that roll release.
Keep coming, we're gonna go to the motor room. Come on, let's go down the slide.
Well, how soon do you have the children start sleeping?
Side to side. Oh, certainly
Yeah, he's trying to tell him.
2 years old is not unreasonable.
Because like I said, my daughter is 6.
You're almost to the motor room. Keep coming.
The only
You're
thing
doing a
that
nice
still
job.
has her doing is pushing it in front of her.
Yeah, she needs to go lateral, side to side. And there's different ways to play with that, you know.
She's been trying to do it, and they told me not to let her do it. And I have to stop her from it.
Well, I don't understand why they wouldn't want to teach her side to side. You can even put 2 hands out if it helps to move the cane side to side and hold your cane with 2 hands. This little fellow is finding a little ball that's on Velcro, and the ball is a symbol of the OT room, the occupational therapy room. Except he enjoys pulling it off the Velcro and putting it on. He likes hearing the sound. So he and the therapist get into a bit of an argument when she wants him to put it back on.
Stick it back on. Let's go in and go down the slide. Come on, let's go. Come on, let's go.
So even the children that have the cognitive delays, you're saying can use.
Oh, absolutely. In his case,
Get up, I'm gonna put it back.
he's gonna get angry now.
Get up. Let's go find Mom. Did you hear Mom? Let's go find Mom. We'll go down the slide.
He wants to take the ball in there. I don't know why they don't let him, but anyway. Yeah, he had some balance issues. So one point of view is you're not ready for the cane because you have balance issues. The other point of view is no, by holding the cane you have a tripod of information, 2 feet and the cane, 3 points touching the ground, and it facilitates better balance.
See, that's what I want to know about Amula. I said, she uses the walker. But if I'm holding her hand on one side, if she has a cane to hold in the other hand, would that not help her get the concept of going forward?
It would help her a little better, but I think the teaching cane, where the adult has the cane and she's holding on the cane, would be better than your hand, because she works more movement herself off of holding on to a
She
shaft.
walk by herself, yeah, because of her foot.
Oh, okay.
But she uses the walker, but I can hold on to that weak side.
That's right. So you can stabilize her there so she
Yeah.
can move with her other hand. This child had that kind of mobility issue, and she's just at the point now. She'll lose her balance every once in a while, but she used to fall. But with the cane, it just is that extra bit of input that she doesn't fall.
Well, that's what I was thinking, because I thought, if I can hold it in one hand, why can she not get this and I go with the other hand?
Have the instructors or anybody talk to you about spatial orientation? Because I'll tell you, we've had to do things in our house to help spatially orientate our daughter. Like, for instance, our big screen TV in our house isn't turned off when we go to bed because it's a location device.
But I have something
Find the motor room?
of my house that didn't like a rug or a bell.
I'm talking about auditory that stays going.
And this is the child that was also tactile, quote, tactile defensive. Whoop, where's the ceiling? Hello. So she lifts the cane up.
Good job. Put it on the floor.
And one way you can decrease tactile defensiveness is learning to hold the cane and contacting objects. Now she's learning to get connected, so the cane hits things, but she still walks because when it hits something, she's not always registering what it needs to do with it. How does that develop? With experience. So the interesting thing is, as she's going for therapy, and her mom's there, and she's going to have, I think, PT now, because the OT has incorporated the cane travel as part of OT, since it's a handheld object. And it's interesting to note that here, for the first time, she hits this mat with her cane, and then lifts the cane on top of the mat, and in her brain she figures out, the cane hit the mat, I better lift my foot up and prepare to step up. And that was her beginning to get connected with the cane. This next video might be the last sequence I show you, because we have to be back by 3. It's called White Cane for Blind Kids. This is available through the NFB. I think it's a very good 12-minute video to bring to an IEP meeting when you want to underscore the importance of the skills of blindness. And you're shooting for skills of blindness that are used by kids whether they have a delay or typical development. And this isn't the entire 12 minutes. This is only part of it.
Both of the girls are hearing impaired also. We don't know the extent.
Get on the trampoline, jump on her trampoline. She's able to.
This is Crystal McLean and her daughter
Classroom. She's able to
Macy and Mark, her husband.
get on the bus, which without her cane she would need assistance all the time. She's able to do anything another child does because she has a cane. It doesn't make her less, it makes her equal.
What's really important is to be able to go where you want to go, when you want to go there, in a safe, efficient, graceful
Cal
manner.
Castellano, who wrote the book
And
I
I think
mentioned.
that's what the cane offers.
I don't really think
Jim Gashaw.
that this particular cane sets the person apart. The thing that really sets them apart is their own attitudes about their blindness and the attitudes of others around them about blindness. Now, hiding blindness by not using a cane, which is one way that we use to hide blindness, doing that, that doesn't change whether or not the child is set apart. In fact, it probably buys right into that notion of setting the child apart, because everybody knows a child can't see real well. So they're defined right there as different, whether or not they've used a cane. Now, at least if they use a cane, then people will realize that they acknowledge that they don't see well and that they're dealing with it in a straightforward manner. And I think people respect that rather than feeling that it's a negative. In fact, I think the cane is an equalizer, because I really think that other children seeing this child with a cane and being involved in the activities, like out on the playground or different things, they say, well, this child is fully integrated with everybody else. He just uses a cane. And what a wonderful thing that is. So I don't think it's a, you know, if it sets somebody apart, that's an attitude thing, not a physical thing.
One of the saddest things I sometimes hear from older blind youngsters, teenagers, and from blind adults is something like this. Now I know that my cane is helpful. I use it all the time. But when I go visit my aunt, it's a constant tussle. She keeps saying, leave that at home. Why don't you take my arm? And my aunt just doesn't understand. And sometimes it's my father or my mother, and it's a real tragedy in the family.
What we're talking about is an attitude about blindness. The cane and braille are symbols of blindness. And until mom and dad and children, young children too, have an attitude that blindness is respectable, that blindness is normal, it is not, there's no need to pity children or adults who are blind, it is not pitiable, that it's okay to be blind, until a child and parents truly feel that way. They probably will resist canes, braille. The cane is a symbol, though, when you feel good about blindness, your own blindness. The cane is a symbol of freedom. It's a symbol of independence. Young children need canes from early on. That was something in the professional field that was not done even 10 years ago. It was rarely done. The Federation has always been on the cutting edge as far as teaching, as far as methods, and understanding, because this is an organization of experts.
As I look at my own life in retrospect, and as I see the remarkable growth and development in the blind children today who get canes early. I didn't get a cane until I was 16. I can tell you it makes all the difference in the world in the kind of confidence, in the knowledge of the world, in the ability to move and take charge of a child's own world that the cane makes in a child's life. With the exception of learning Braille, it seems to me that learning to analyze the information that comes in through a tip of a white cane is the single most important thing that a child can learn at an early age. And the earlier a child learns to use a cane confidently and competently, the more effective that life will be forever afterwards. Every parent has an instinct to keep the child safe. That goes along with parenthood. For every parent, the whole process of a child's growing up is untying apron strings, one after another, all through life. I'm sure it must be very painful for the parent of a blind child to find the courage to begin untying those apron strings. But it's what we are all called to do as parents. It's the only way for a child to grow. Unfortunately, You can't make your child not blind. What you can do is to see that the child can live a full, productive, healthy, happy life. That can't happen if a child has less than 10% of normal vision and is trying to compete with people with normal vision, unless that child has the alternative skills of blindness. You can't make your child be not blind. What you can do is to make your child a normal human being who happens to use a white cane. It seems to me that's a hard decision. It's a painful decision to make, but it's the only reasonable, healthy decision to make.
As I mentioned, that's White Canes for Blind Kids. It's 12 minutes long, and it's really good to have for any educating the public, the IEP, perhaps one for your library, that type of thing. Doris Willoughby was one of the persons who shared there briefly. She was the one that said sometimes the grandmother or even a family member says, you know, don't take your cane, may be a tragedy in the family. Doris and Sharon Monthy wrote what I think is the best text on the market for learning about the longer cane approach to travel, or just cane travel in general, and it's modular instruction for independent travel for students who are blind or visually impaired, preschool through high school. And it's for those instructors who do not know about the lighter, longer cane approach, this is a text that really gives them the information. And it's a text for parents who homeschool their kids. It's a text for other professional service providers. And it's exhaustive, technical, and very logical in its presentation. And as I said, it's the best book on the market for learning about the basic cane skills. My approach today has kind of been bottom up meets top down, because I think a lot of us have information about how the adults do it and older kids do it, but we don't quite know how the little ones birth to 5 or 6 or 7 do it, especially birth to 3. So I hope that the information I provided heads us a little bit more in that direction and working together in partnerships as parents and professional service providers and blind mentors from the Organized Blind in promoting this independent movement in travel and blind children. There are a number of factors that impact upon blind children, whether it has something to do with something like septo-optic dysplasia, or the corpus callosum is partially missing or completely missing, or the event of prematurity. And whatever the reasons are, it affects spatial orientation. And so that sometimes they're consistent and sometimes not. I think sound clues, not only an obvious noise in the environment, but the echolocation can be very helpful. So one example is a little boy that I worked with who could just never get left and right, and was really, really quite bright. I mean, IQ-wise, was way up there above 120, and yet that was a problem. So for him, for example, when he came out of his hallway, of his room, the bathroom was way at the end of the hallway to the left, and the exit was only about 10 feet down. So instead of thinking left and right, I would say to him, tap your cane and listen for long hallway sound. And when you hear long hallway, go in that direction. Go where you hear it. That, he had no problem with getting echolocation. He'd tap his cane, hear a long hallway, turn in the direction, and then as he got to the end of the hall, he heard the close of the end of the hall, moved over, scanned his wall, found the bathroom. So echolocation can be a clue. In other words, it's not left and right. Sometimes it's a question with the younger ones, how does it feel? Do you remember how it felt the last time? Let's not think about left or right. How does it feel to go back to your classroom? And sometimes kids invariably will intuitively feel it on a gut level from motor memory than they will from a cognitively driven left and right, because that's where the problem somehow gets, confusing. Another thing, if left and right, is maybe on the left or right hand wearing a bracelet or something, so you have, that as a marker. But having said all that, I think the vast experience that's just accumulated where you walk in the presence of mom and dad, or you walk in the presence of friends, or you walk in the presence in a group of classmates without holding on to their arm, would serve the purpose of more self-initiating the thought and observing your own movement than holding on to someone. And that is something that, in other words, we can do the OT or physical therapy 3 times a week, once a week. We can do the mobility instructor and work it into the IEP once a week, twice a week, 5 times a week. I only went out in the field twice a month for the kids that I saw that I was teaching cane travel. My caseloads were outrageous. And that's why I rolled release. I learned to teach parents first from the home, then the school and the staff, and they would follow through. Because I would come back the next time and this cane tip wasn't worn out. And I could see it wasn't being used. So by role releasing to parents and staff, they would practice it. The skills really advanced. And I can tell you right now, knowing personally of a situation where a child is as you described when she was younger. And I know her now, and she's graduating college in a year. And she makes her way on a college campus independently because she knows how to ask questions, and she's learned to walk in the presence of people, or solo, but not with the human guide, not with being guided all the time. So that would be my cautious but best advice I could give you. Okay. Any other questions before we go back? Well, thank you. It's been really delightful here today. Really appreciate the invite.